I wanted to mention this because I hadn't seen it covered anywhere else. The New York Times had a really interesting story about divorce in the Philippines, where it is illegal, if you didn't know.
We want to be free. That's the message of an increasing number of women in the Philippines who are trapped in marriages they cannot escape. That's because divorce is illegal in the Catholic majority country. The only other place in the world where this is the case is the Vatican. Calls by activists are growing louder for divorce to be legalized, but they face a powerful opposition.
It has a really strange and long history of being legal and illegal in the Philippines with American occupation, Japanese occupation. The New York Times goes further into detail about that, but generally it's been illegal in the country since 1950, except for Muslim citizens, which are 5% of the population. They are allowed to divorce, the rest of the population cannot. Little quirks in the Philippines. But in recent months, the New York Times says the Senate committee there approved a bill on divorce for the first time in more than 30 years. The bill is now awaiting, they say, a second reading in the Senate, which lawmakers say could happen next year. So it's not a sure thing, but it seems like there is a possibility that it could pass, which would be a massive change. Of course, divorce is very important for a lot of different reasons. If you're in an abusive marriage, the fact that even if you just hate each other's guts in the Philippines, you still need to get your spouse's signature to buy a house or do anything if you have kids. So it's messy.
Yeah, I didn't know. I had assumed most countries divorce between two heterosexual adults is legal. Clearly, an incorrect assumption. It's widely seen that while many people worry about divorce rates as eroding families and leading to all sorts of negative social consequences, right? That's the kind of conservative argument, and I think almost every country, small c conservative. This is not making that as a generalizable about political conservatives. The lack of optionality is clearly not served, particularly women, very well in any society, which is different than saying, is it a good thing to stay together? Is it better to have a family unit for raising children? Does that lead to better long-term outcomes? Like, those are legitimate questions to ask in terms of, should divorce be something one does easily or in a hard way? But that's all totally different than, should the state make it harder, right? Should one individually be more mindful of the consequences, particularly with young kids? Sure, I think that's probably a discussion worth having, but that's totally different than the coercive powers of the state telling you you can or can't do something.
Yeah. And the Times quotes a judge's ruling from some woman who wanted to get her marriage annulled and spent a lot of money trying to do it. And they called marriage an insoluble institution by the state, something like that, which, yeah, despite your point about the conversation of, is there too much divorce happening? Should parents stay together for the sake of the kids? In these more extreme circumstances, as I mentioned, especially in the case of domestic violence, viewing marriage as something that is forever in the eyes of the government, something very different from the discussion that we're having here. And I also didn't realize that there were countries in the midst of having that discussion. So, yeah.
There you go.
There you go. So we leave that to people to form their own opinions about. I wonder too what requirements that you will need in the Philippines to get a divorce, if it's the bill is just how it would be in the US, where you can just kind of say I'd like one, or if it's going to be more strict. I imagine it would be more strict.
I mean, it is clearly the case, and we talk about this in terms of progress or regress, that authoritarian governments that rely on kind of traditional values are more likely to be against the expansion of LGBTQ rights, of divorce, of abortion, of contraception, of all sorts of things that characterize the mid-20th century, particularly, the opening up of what had been more traditionally closed frameworks, as well as drug use, right? We talked about just now. And that there is a global tug of war going on where there are a bunch of countries that certainly utilize sort of social conservatism, traditional values: no divorce, no premarital sex, no abortion, no contraception, women's place being home, family, kids. So you do have this in Russia, you have this in Uganda. It's there are places where these things clearly are being pushed back from whatever advances were made. But we've tried to highlight a lot, and you've highlighted a lot in the newsletter, and we've discussed on the show. There are a lot of times where these things don't line up, and places that are otherwise politically dysfunctional or maybe more authoritarian minded can also be somewhat socially liberal. But it is something that I think look out for, where you do have a tendency of more authoritarian governments to want to reinforce more rigid social mores and rules rather than the kind of fluidity of sex, drugs, and rock and roll that has characterized a lot of contemporary 20th and 21st century culture.
Right. And let's not forget there's probably a happy medium between those two things.
Probably.
I reminded myself to add in the Philippines, which is interesting that they legalized contraception 10 years ago. So they're kind of on a particular path, it seems.
Right.
Maybe not to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but a little bit more open.
Yeah, well. And as we just saw from our conversation with Drew Faust, the loosening of these rules has been absolutely essential to, I guess, liberating women or creating a more gender neutral societies, or where the opportunities for women are at least somewhat equivalent to men, which includes things not just like paid sick leave, but paid childcare and childcare leave. So not linear, not straight, not simple, not without a step back with the two steps forward. But if you're to look at the world today versus the world 100 years ago, and again, in light of our conversation with Drew Gilpin Faust, you'd have to say that there has been more positive movement everywhere, or almost everywhere in the world, than not.
100%.